You've seen it before, maybe in an old photograph of a hospital ward from the early 1900s, maybe in a period drama set during one of the world wars. A nurse in a white uniform with a tiny watch pinned to her chest, hanging upside down. At first glance, it looks like she put it on wrong, like she got dressed in a rush and clipped it backwards. At least, that's what most people assume. But that watch wasn't broken, and it wasn't a mistake. It was one of the most cleverly designed medical tools in the history of nursing. And the reason it's upside down has to do with something you'd never think about unless you spent 12 hours on your feet in a hospital ward with blood on your hands. Centuries before that watch ended up on a nurse's uniform, portable timekeeping didn't even exist. Before the 1500s, if you wanted to know what time it was, you looked up at the tower clock in the town square or listened for the monastery bells. Time was a public thing. Nobody carried it around. That changed in Nuremberg, Germany, around 1510. A locksmith named Peter Henlein figured out how to build a spring-driven mechanism small enough to hold in your hand. His early creations were these rounded brass cases people called Nuremberg eggs. They were bulky, they were expensive, and they lost about an hour of accuracy per day. But for the first time, a person could own their own clock. Over the next few centuries, those egg-shaped contraptions evolved. They got smaller, flatter, more precise. By the 1700s and 1800s, pocket watches were everywhere. Gentlemen kept them on chains, tucked into waistcoat pockets. Women wore smaller versions on ribbons or short chains pinned to their clothing. And that second version, the one pinned to the clothing, is where our story really starts. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to most people. Nursing in the 1800s was brutal, unglamorous work. Hospitals were filthy, infection ran wild. Nurses were on their feet for punishing shifts, constantly working with their hands, touching patients, handling dressings, emptying basins. Their hands were almost never clean and almost never free. So think about what it actually takes to check a pocket watch. You need to stop what you're doing. Reach into a pocket. Pull the watch out with wet or soiled fingers. Open the case. Read the dial. Close it. Put it back. That's a lot of steps when someone is bleeding out or their breathing just changed. Now think about a wristwatch. Seems easier, right? Just glance at your wrist. Except here's the problem. The underside of a wristwatch band, the part that sits against your skin, is basically a petri dish. Warm, damp, pressed tight against the skin all shift long. Bacteria like Staphylococcus aureus love that environment. And if you're washing your hands dozens of times per day, which nurses absolutely are, a wristwatch gets in the way of cleaning the wrists properly. Water and soap get trapped underneath. Skin gets irritated. Germs get missed. If you're wondering how that's even allowed, well, eventually it wasn't. Some clever nurse, and history doesn't record exactly who, came up with an elegant hack. Take a small watch, pin it to your uniform at the chest, upside down, with the dial facing outward. Now when you look down at it, the numbers read right side up from your perspective. You can glance at it in a second. Your hands never leave the patient. Nothing gets contaminated. Nothing gets fumbled. And there's one more thing that made this design essential. Something that separates it from just a convenient way to tell time. Nurses don't just check the time to know when their shift ends. They check the time dozens of times per hour because they're counting. When a nurse takes your pulse, she presses 2 fingers to the inside of your wrist, feels the rhythm of your heartbeat, and counts the beats against a precise time interval. 30 seconds for a regular pulse, a full 60 seconds if the rhythm seems off. That count gives her the number of heartbeats per minute, which is one of the most fundamental vital signs in all of medicine. To do this, she needs a watch with a sweeping second hand, and she needs to see that second hand without moving her hands away from the patient's wrist. A fob watch pinned to her chest does exactly that. 2 fingers on your pulse, eyes on the watch, counting silently. No fumbling, no reaching, no letting go. And it's not just pulse. Respiratory rate works the same way. A nurse watches your chest rise and fall while timing the breaths against that same second hand. often right after taking your pulse, without even telling the patient she's doing it. Because if you know someone is counting your breaths, you start breathing differently. So yeah, not just a fashion accessory. The fob watch wasn't a quirky tradition. It was a hands-free, hygienic, precision medical instrument disguised as a piece of jewelry. Alright, so here's where things get really interesting. Everything about the fob watch lines up with a revolution in nursing that traces back to one woman, Florence Nightingale. In 1854, during the Crimean War, Nightingale arrived at the British military hospitals near the front lines and found absolute horror. Soldiers were dying in droves, and not from their wounds. They were dying from cholera, typhus, dysentery, all infections born from filthy conditions. Overcrowded wards, no ventilation, contaminated water, and zero understanding of how disease spread. Nightingale changed everything. She scrubbed the wards from floor to ceiling. She insisted on constant hand washing, which was practically a radical idea at the time. She demanded clean linens, fresh air, and proper nutrition. The mortality rate in her hospital dropped dramatically. Her philosophy was simple and relentless. Remove every possible source of contamination. And that philosophy shaped what nurses wore, how they moved, and what tools they carried for the next century and a half. The fob watch fits this philosophy perfectly. It doesn't touch skin surfaces that contact patients. It doesn't require handling. It doesn't interfere with hand washing. It's a Nightingale tool, even though she didn't invent it. But this wasn't just about the past anymore. Modern hospitals took this idea and ran with it. In the 2000s, Britain's National Health Service introduced what's called the bare below the elbows policy. The rule is exactly what it sounds like. When healthcare workers enter clinical areas, everything below the elbows has to be bare. That means no wristwatches, no bracelets, no rings with stones, no long sleeves. Research had shown that hand and wrist jewelry can harbor dangerous bacteria, and that proper hand washing is nearly impossible when you're wearing a watch. Hospitals in Australia, Europe, and parts of the United States adopted similar guidelines. And suddenly, the old-fashioned fob watch had a second life. Hospitals that banned wristwatches still needed their nurses to count pulses and time medications. The fob watch, pinned safely above the elbows on the chest of a uniform, was the perfect solution. It had been the perfect solution for over 100 years. Modern medicine just finally caught up to what generations of nurses already knew. And somehow, it gets worse for the wristwatch. One study published in the Journal of Clinical and Diagnostic Research found that the area beneath a wristwatch harbored significantly higher bacterial counts compared to bare skin. The bacteria found included Staphylococcus aureus and other pathogens that can cause serious hospital-acquired infections. For immunocompromised patients, the kind of people already vulnerable and already in the hospital, those bacteria could be life-threatening. Today, if you walk into a nursing school almost anywhere in the UK or Australia, there's a good chance one of the first things they teach you is how to read a fob watch while taking a radial pulse. And in many families, the tradition of giving a graduating nurse a fob watch as a gift is still alive. It's a rite of passage, the same way a doctor might receive a stethoscope. The fob watch, that once looked like a little mistake on a nurse's uniform, turns out to be one of those rare objects where every single design choice, from the upside-down face to the pin attachment to the second hand, exists for a specific, practical, life-or-death reason. It's a tiny clock that saved lives not by telling the future, but by making sure nurses could count the seconds that mattered most, without ever letting go of the patient. That tradition, that instinct to find simple, clever tools that keep patients safer, is something that's endured in nursing for over a century. And every fob watch pinned to a uniform today carries that same purpose forward. Anyway, if stuff like this interests you, hit subscribe. I cover weird history and the stories behind everyday things every week. And if you want to keep going, the video on screen right now is one I think you'll like.